My name is Claire, and I have always believed that books hold the answers to questions we don't even know we're asking. Working at the town library wasn't just a job for me. It was my safe haven. The quietness, the smell of old paper, the soft hum of the heater during winter. It all made me feel like I belonged somewhere. But I had no idea that one autumn afternoon, when I climbed into the attic of my grandmother's old house, I was about to stumble into someone else's unfinished story, and maybe begin my own. It was late October, and the Vermont air was crisp with the bite of early frost. My grandmother had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving me her little white cottage on the edge of Maplewood town. I had spent the last few weeks sorting through her things, one dusty box at a time. The attic was the last place left to clean, and honestly, I dreaded it. My grandmother was a collector of everything: lace curtains, porcelain dolls, even broken clocks. I thought it would be nothing but clutter. But when I pushed open the heavy attic door and stepped inside, the golden shafts of light from the small window fell upon something different. A wooden box, worn smooth with age, its lid tied shut with faded ribbon. My heart gave a small leap. I pulled it closer, brushing off a layer of dust, and carefully untied the ribbon. Inside were stacks of yellowed envelopes, neatly arranged, each one addressed in elegant handwriting, "To my dearest Eleanor." I sat cross-legged on the creaky floorboards and pulled out the first letter. The paper was fragile, the ink slightly smudged, but the words were clear. October 14th, 1962. My beloved Eleanor. Today, the leaves fell like fire from the trees, and I wished you were here to see them. The army calls me away again, but it is thoughts of you that keep me steady. One day, I swear, I will walk back through the gates of Maplewood and hold your hand under the autumn sky. Until then, know that you are my every heartbeat. I felt my breath catch. It was like stepping back in time into someone else's private world. Who was this soldier? Who was Eleanor? And why had these letters been hidden away for decades in my grandmother's attic? I read 3 more letters before the daylight dimmed. Each one was tender, filled with longing and hope, always signed with the same name. Yours forever, Thomas. My fingers trembled as I tucked the letters back inside. I knew I shouldn't feel this strongly about words written 60 years ago, but I couldn't help it. I felt their love, real, raw, unfinished. That night, I couldn't sleep. The letters replayed in my mind like whispers. Why hadn't Eleanor answered? Why weren't her letters in the box, too? And what had happened to Thomas? The next morning, as I walked through Maplewood's main street on my way to the library, I found myself seeing everything differently. The red brick buildings, the old diner, the coffee shop with its pumpkin spice scent, all of it looked like pieces of a puzzle. Somewhere in this little town, there had to be traces of Eleanor and Thomas. That's when I noticed him. A man standing outside the carpenter's shop, running his hands over a freshly built wooden bench. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-touched skin and dark hair falling slightly over his forehead. His eyes lifted and met mine for just a second, and something stirred inside me, something I couldn't explain. I quickly looked away, clutching the library keys tighter in my hand, but even as I walked off, I felt his gaze lingering like an echo. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, those letters in the attic weren't the only story waiting to unfold in Maplewood. I tried to keep my thoughts on work that day, shelving books, answering questions from the usual patrons, and stamping due dates on novels that smelled of rain and old coffee. But the truth was, my mind was far from the library. Every time I slid a book onto the shelf, I thought of the letters. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the soldier's handwriting. And more disturbingly, every time I inhaled, I remembered the face of the man outside the carpenter's shop. By the afternoon, my curiosity had grown unbearable. During my lunch break, I tucked a few of the letters into my bag and slipped into the diner across the street. The waitress, Martha, a woman in her 50s with the warmest smile in Maplewood, poured me a cup of coffee. "You look distracted today, Claire," she said, raising an eyebrow as she set down my plate of fries. "Do I?" I asked, forcing a smile. "More than usual," she teased. "What's on your mind? Don't tell me it's another novel." I hesitated. Martha had lived in this town her whole life. She knew everyone's stories. I pulled out one of the letters and slid it across the table. She adjusted her glasses and began to read. Slowly, her expression softened. "Thomas Miller," she murmured. "I haven't heard that name in years." My pulse quickened. "You know him?" She nodded. He was a young man from Maplewood, joined the army in the 60s. Handsome, polite, full of dreams. Everyone thought he'd marry Eleanor Hart, sweetest girl in town. But her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. They never did. No one ever knew why. I leaned forward. Do you know what happened to him? Martha sighed, staring out the window. Rumor was he never came back from the war, but some say he did, only for a short time. He disappeared from town not long after. As for Eleanor, she stayed here, but she never married. She lived a quiet life, then passed away about 10 years ago. My chest tightened. So the letters had been real. Their love had been real. But why had my grandmother kept them? And why were they hidden away instead of treasured? I thanked Martha and tucked the letter back into my bag, but I felt more restless than before. There were still too many unanswered questions. That evening, after the library closed, I found myself walking down the street toward the carpenter's shop. The man I'd seen the day before was inside, working on a chair. The shop smelled of sawdust and pine, the sound of sandpaper brushing against wood filling the air. He looked up as I stepped in. His eyes were hazel, flecked with green, and for a moment I forgot how to speak. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," I stammered. I've never been in here before." He set the chair aside and wiped his hands on a rag. "Well, welcome. I'm Ethan." "Claire," I replied, my voice steadier this time. Something about him felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. We stood there in silence for a beat too long before I finally asked, "Have you always lived in Maplewood?" He shook his head. "No. I grew up here, but I left for a while. Just moved back a few months ago. Thought it was time." His words stirred something in me, like an echo of Thomas's promise in those letters, that he would return. We talked a little longer, mostly small things. How quiet the town was. How autumn was always the most beautiful season here. But as I left, I felt a strange connection lingering, as if threads of the past were weaving into the present. That night, I sat by the fireplace with the letters spread around me. I read them again, slower this time, as though Thomas himself were whispering in my ear. One line stood out. "If ever fate tears us apart, I hope one day someone will carry our love forward." I shivered, clutching the paper to my chest. For reasons I couldn't explain, I had the feeling fate wasn't done with Thomas and Eleanor's story. And somehow, I was standing right in the middle of it. The next few days passed with an odd rhythm. I'd spend my mornings at the library, pretending to care about overdue fees and misplaced romance novels. But in truth, my thoughts were always in the attic with those letters, or across town in the carpenter's shop with Ethan. I didn't know why I kept finding excuses to walk past his shop. Sometimes I told myself it was just coincidence. Other times, I admitted silently that it wasn't. Each time he'd greet me with that quiet smile, the kind that said more than words ever could. We never spoke for long, just a few minutes about the weather or the upcoming harvest fair, but something about his presence felt grounding, as if he belonged to the same invisible thread that was pulling me deeper into the mystery of Thomas and Eleanor. On Saturday morning, I couldn't resist any longer. I carried the wooden box of letters down from the attic and set it on my kitchen table. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid again. The letters smelled faintly of cedar and dust, and each one felt like holding a fragile heartbeat. I picked one at random. December the 2nd, 1962. Dearest Eleanor, the nights are long and cold, but your memory keeps me warm. I dream of building us a home here in Maplewood, a place with white shutters and a garden you'll tend with laughter. When this war is over, I will come back to you. Hold on to that promise. Yours, Thomas. The words pierced me. A home with white shutters. My grandmother's cottage, the one I was living in now, had white shutters. My fingers froze on the page. Could it be possible that my grandmother had been Eleanor? But her name was Margaret, unless... A sudden knock at the door startled me. I quickly slid the letters back into the box before answering. Ethan stood on my porch, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The crisp autumn air swirled around him. "Hi," he said, almost shyly. "I was walking by and thought I'd check if you needed help with anything around the house. These old cottages can be stubborn." For a moment, I just stared at him. Then I laughed nervously. That's really thoughtful. Actually, my attic ladder sticks. Maybe you could look at it? He nodded, following me inside. As he tested the creaky ladder, I found myself studying him more closely, the way his shoulders filled the space, the care in his movements. He didn't rush, he paid attention. There, he said after a moment, tightening a hinge. That should make it easier. Thank you, I murmured. His eyes flicked to the box on the kitchen table. What's that? I hesitated, my instinct telling me to guard the letters, but something about Ethan's steady gaze felt trustworthy. Old family things, I said softly. Letters. He stepped closer. May I? I hesitated again, then nodded. He carefully lifted one envelope as if it might crumble in his hands. His brow furrowed as he read. Thomas Miller, he whispered. I know that name. My heart thudded. How? He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw something vulnerable in his eyes. Thomas was my grandfather. The air seemed to leave the room. I sank into a chair, stunned. All this time, I'd been chasing the echoes of a stranger's love story, only to find that the man standing in front of me carried its blood in his veins. I didn't know him, Ethan continued quietly. He died before I was born. My dad never talked much about him. Just that he left Maplewood under difficult circumstances. I pressed a hand to my chest. Your grandfather wrote these letters, to Eleanor. He nodded slowly. And somehow they ended up here, in your house. We stared at each other, the weight of 60 years pressing down between us. The letters were no longer just history. They were a bridge, connecting his past and my present. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just their story anymore. It was ours too. I don't think I breathed properly for a full minute after Ethan told me Thomas was his grandfather. The weight of that truth sat heavy in the room, thick as the dust that floated in the attic air. You mean, I finally whispered. The man who wrote these letters, the man who loved Eleanor, he was your grandfather. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. Yes, but I don't understand. How did his letters end up here? In your grandmother's house? The question stung, because I didn't know either. My grandmother had never once mentioned Thomas Miller nor an Eleanor Hart. She'd lived a quiet life, married young, raised my mother, and passed away leaving this cottage to me. But as I glanced at the white shutters outside the window, Thomas's words echoed again. A home with white shutters. Could my grandmother Margaret and Eleanor Hart be the same woman? Or had their stories crossed paths in ways I couldn't yet see? I don't have the answers, I admitted, my voice shaky. But I think we're meant to find them. Ethan studied me for a long moment, his eyes steady, searching. Then he nodded. Maybe we are. That night, I invited him to stay and read more of the letters with me. We sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting warm light over the fragile papers. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the shutters, but inside, the air felt intimate, charged with something unspoken. Ethan picked one letter at random and began to read aloud. His deep voice carried Thomas's words as though they belonged to him. March 15th, 1963. Dearest Eleanor, I can't explain the world I've seen here, but I know I'll never let it harden me. I hold on to the memory of your smile, the promise of our life together. Whatever comes, I'll endure it. For you. Yours always, Thomas. His voice faltered slightly at the end. I watched his hands tremble as he set the letter down. It's strange, he said softly. I never knew him, but reading these, it's like hearing him speak through time. I felt a lump in my throat. And maybe he wanted you to. Maybe that's why these letters waited here all these years, for you. Our eyes met, and for a moment I forgot about the decades between Thomas and Eleanor. I only felt the present, the warmth in Ethan's gaze, the way the room seemed smaller when he was in it. The following week, we made it our mission to uncover the truth. Every evening after work, Ethan would stop by with coffee or sandwiches, and we'd spread the letters across the table like puzzle pieces. We mapped out dates, cross-referenced names, even checked old town records at the library. Slowly, a picture began to form. Eleanor Hart had lived in Maplewood all her life. She and Thomas had been inseparable before he went to war. But after 1964, her name rarely appeared in town events. She seemed to fade quietly into the background until her death 10 years ago. One night, while flipping through an old Maplewood Gazette newspaper, I froze. There, in black and white, was a photograph from 1963. A smiling young woman in a floral dress standing beside a soldier in uniform. The caption read, "Local hero Thomas Miller with fiancée Eleanor Hart at Maplewood Festival." My heart pounded. "She was real," I whispered. "They were engaged." Ethan traced the photo with his finger, his expression unreadable. But then, something happened. Silence stretched between us. The letters had promised a reunion, a life together. Yet history told a different story. I leaned back, the weight of it pressing on me. "Ethan, I think our families have been bound together by this secret for decades. Maybe it's up to us to finally bring it into the light." He looked at me then, his hazel eyes intense. "Then we'll do it together." And in that moment, with the fire crackling low and the letters spread like wings between us, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. Somewhere in the middle of lost promises and faded ink, Ethan and I were writing something new, something that belonged to us. It's strange how quickly someone can become part of your routine. A month ago, Ethan was just a stranger sanding wood in a shop window. Now he was in my kitchen almost every evening, his sleeves rolled up, his laughter mingling with the sound of crackling fire. His presence filling the spaces of this house I once thought felt too big for me. But alongside the warmth, there was an unshakable pull toward the mystery we still hadn't solved. The letters had carried us far, but the ending remained elusive. Why had Thomas left? Why hadn't Eleanor followed him? Why had my grandmother kept their words hidden? One night, as the first snow of the season dusted Maplewood streets, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with thought. "Claire," he said slowly, "what if your grandmother Margaret was somehow connected to Eleanor more closely than we think? A cousin? A friend?" I bit my lip. Or, what if she was Eleanor? The words hung in the air like frost. Ethan frowned. "But the names don't match." "I know, but people change names. Maybe she left Eleanor behind for a reason." We both fell silent, the weight of possibility pressing down on us. Finally, Ethan spoke again, softer this time. "There's one person who might know, my father." I sat up straighter. "Your father?" "He doesn't talk much about the past," Ethan admitted. "But maybe if he sees the letters, maybe he'll tell us the truth." The following weekend, I found myself nervously clutching the wooden box as Ethan drove us to the edge of town. His father, Daniel Miller, lived in a small farmhouse surrounded by bare maple trees. The house smelled of cedar and old tobacco, the kind of place that carried memories in its walls. Daniel was a tall man with weathered hands and tired eyes. He looked at me with curiosity, then at the box I carried. When Ethan explained, his father's face paled. "You found his letters," Daniel whispered, almost to himself. He reached out, touching the envelopes with reverence, as if they were holy relics. "Dad," Ethan said gently, "tell us what happened. Who was Eleanor?" For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he lowered himself into a chair and pressed his hands together. "Eleanor was your grandfather's fiancée. They were deeply in love. But when Thomas came back from the war, he wasn't the same. He was haunted, broken. He loved her, but he felt he couldn't give her the life she deserved." My throat tightened as he spoke. "So he left?" Ethan asked, his voice rough. Daniel nodded. "He left Maplewood, disappeared. Some say he wrote to her, some say he didn't. All I know is that Eleanor stayed behind. She never married. She carried that silence with her until the end." I felt tears sting my eyes. Their love hadn't ended because they stopped caring. It ended because life, cruel and unforgiving, had torn them apart. "But," Daniel hesitated, glancing at me, "there's something else. I remember hearing whispers when I was a boy. People said Eleanor changed her name later in life, Margaret. I don't know why. Maybe to escape the memories. Maybe to hide from the pain." My breath caught. Margaret, my grandmother. Ethan turned to me, his eyes wide. Claire. It all crashed over me at once. The letters in my attic, the white shutters, the silence my grandmother carried. She had been Eleanor. She had been the woman Thomas loved. I clutched the edge of the table, struggling to steady myself. All this time, I whispered. She never told me. She kept it locked away, like a secret she couldn't bear to share. Daniel placed a hand on the box. Those letters were her heart. She must have wanted someone to find them, to finally know the truth. The room was heavy with sorrow, yet somewhere deep inside me, a spark of something else flickered. As if the unfinished love story of Thomas and Eleanor was not just a tragedy. It was a thread weaving its way into the present, into me and Ethan. When we left Daniel's farmhouse that night, the snow was falling harder, blanketing the world in silence. Ethan walked beside me, his arm brushing mine. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. Because in that quiet, I felt it too. The undeniable truth that sometimes love skips a generation, only to return when the world is finally ready. The days after visiting Daniel felt different, as though I were walking through Maplewood with new eyes. Every street corner, every snow-dusted rooftop seemed to whisper pieces of a story I now knew belonged to my grandmother. Eleanor Hart, Margaret, as I had always known her, had lived a life of quiet sacrifice, carrying her unfinished love like a hidden scar. Sometimes I would sit by the attic window, the letters spread out before me, and imagine her as a young woman standing in the same place. Did she climb these stairs late at night to read Thomas's words over and over, praying for a future that never came? Did she lock them away because she couldn't bear the ache of seeing his handwriting without his hand to hold? One evening, Ethan joined me in the attic. The air was cold, our breaths visible in the dim light of a single lamp. He crouched beside me, running his fingers over one of the letters. "It feels strange," he said quietly, "knowing my grandfather's heart lived in these words, and that your grandmother was the one he wrote them for." I looked at him, the soft shadows deepening the lines of his face. "Do you ever wonder," I asked, "if we were meant to find this? That somehow their story led us here?" He met my gaze and didn't look away. "I've been wondering that since the first day we spoke." Silence hung between us, heavy and fragile. My heart thudded painfully, torn between the sorrow of what had been lost and the possibility of what could still be found. Over the next week, Ethan and I spent even more time together. We walked through Maplewood's Christmas market, lights twinkling above us, children laughing as they clutched hot cocoa. We shared quiet dinners in the diner, where Martha teased us for looking like two characters out of a Hallmark movie. And late at night, we sat by the fire, sometimes reading aloud from the letters, sometimes saying nothing at all. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore what was growing between us. It was in the way he looked at me when I laughed, the way his hand brushed mine when we passed a letter back and forth, the way silence with him felt less like emptiness and more like a promise. But with that closeness came fear. One night, as the wind howled outside, I confessed it. "I'm scared, Ethan," I whispered. "What if we're just repeating their story? What if it ends the same way, unfinished, painful?" He turned to me, his hazel eyes steady. "Claire, their story ended in silence. But ours doesn't have to. We're not them. We get to choose." His words wrapped around me like warmth, easing a part of me I hadn't realized was clenched so tightly. A few days later, we stumbled upon the final letter in the box. It was different from the others, written in a shakier hand, the ink darker, the tone more desperate. October 1964. My dearest Eleanor, I cannot face you. The war has left me hollow, and I fear I'll only break you if I stay. Forgive me for leaving. Forgive me for not being the man you deserve. But know this, every heartbeat I ever had belonged to you. Even in my silence, even in my absence, it was always you. Always. Yours until the end, Thomas. I felt tears stream down my face as I read it aloud. Ethan's jaw clenched, his hand gripping the arm of his chair. "He left because he loved her," Ethan said finally, his voice rough, "because he thought leaving would protect her." I pressed the letter to my chest, sobbing softly. But she carried that pain forever. Ethan reached across the space between us, taking my hand in his. His touch was firm, grounding. "Then let's not waste what they lost. Let's not hide, not run, let's choose differently. In that moment, I knew. The letters were not just relics of a past love. They were warnings, reminders, invitations. And sitting there with Ethan's hand holding mine, I felt the first flicker of something my grandmother had been denied, the chance to begin again. The last letter changed everything. For days, I carried it in my coat pocket, unable to put it back in the box. I would pull it out at odd moments, standing at the kitchen sink, walking through the snowy town, or lying awake at night, and trace the faded ink with my fingers. It was as if Thomas's final words had reached across decades to speak not only to Eleanor, but to me. One evening, Ethan and I walked through Maplewood's old park. The trees were bare, their branches etched like black ink against the pale winter sky. Snow crunched beneath our boots, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke. We sat down on a bench near the frozen pond, the same spot my grandmother and Thomas must have once shared. Ethan's voice broke the silence. Do you think they ever imagined this? That their grandchildren would be sitting here one day, wondering what to do with the love they couldn't hold on to? I smiled faintly, brushing snow from my gloves. Maybe that's the point. Maybe their story wasn't meant to end with them. Maybe it was meant to find us. He turned to me, his expression unguarded, raw. Claire, I don't want to waste this. I don't want to keep pretending that what I feel is just coincidence or nostalgia. It's more than that. It's you. The world seemed to fall away. The frozen pond, the skeletal trees, even the aching history behind us. All that existed in that moment was his gaze, steady and unflinching, and the truth I had been afraid to admit even to myself. I reached for his hand, my heart pounding. It's you too, Ethan. From the very first moment. He exhaled a laugh, shaky with relief, and pulled me closer. His lips brushed mine, soft at first, then deeper, surer, as though generations of silence were breaking open at once. In that kiss, I felt my grandmother's sorrow finally lift, like snow melting beneath the first warmth of spring. Their love had ended in silence, but ours didn't have to. The weeks that followed were filled with both tenderness and resolve. Ethan and I began weaving our lives together, not as echoes of the past, but as something new. We restored the attic room, leaving the letters carefully preserved in a glass case, a tribute to the love that had brought us here. Sometimes we read them aloud, not as wounds anymore, but as blessings. Maplewood seemed to embrace us too. Martha at the diner would slide us extra slices of pie with a knowing wink. Neighbors stopped us in the street to remark how right we looked together. Even the old church bells, ringing each Sunday, felt like an approval from time itself. One evening, as snow drifted softly outside, Ethan surprised me. He led me up to the attic, where the letters sat glowing under the lamp. Beside them, he had placed a small velvet box. My breath caught. Ethan. He took my hands, his eyes shining. I don't want to wait decades to tell you what's already true. I love you, Claire, and I want every tomorrow with you. Tears blurred my vision as he opened the box, revealing a simple ring that sparkled like the winter sky. My grandmother's story had been one of waiting, of what-ifs and unfinished dreams. Mine didn't have to be. Yes, I whispered, my voice trembling but sure. Yes, Ethan. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt the weight of generations shift, not as a burden, but as a gift. Looking back now, I realized the letters weren't just about Eleanor and Thomas. They were about love itself, the way it endures, the way it bends but doesn't break, the way it finds its way forward even after years of silence. My grandmother never got her ending, but because of her, I found mine. And in the quiet attic of a little house in Maplewood, surrounded by snow and memory, Ethan and I began a story of our own. One not written in hidden letters, but in the open pages of every day we had yet to live.